My name is Elowen Hart, and on the morning everything shifted, the kettles sang to an empty kitchen. Steam feathered the window glass, making the old maple in the backyard look like a watercolor. I stood with one hand cupped around my mug and one foot braced against the cabinet while a message from my sister, Rhea, glowed on my phone. It said simply, "Keys collected. Please don't come by the house without coordinating." Without coordinating. It was my father's house, the place where the porch boards remembered our bare feet and the gutter sang during summer storms. I set the phone down as if it were hot metal. Outside, a garbage truck hissed and rattled down the street. Somewhere, a dog barked twice, urgent, confused, and fell silent. The world, I realized, didn't pause for a single text. I drove to the house the way you take a road you've known forever, expecting the turns to greet you like relatives at a reunion. Gold leaves, early and eager, swept across the asphalt. When I pulled up, the front gate stood ajar, but the worn brass knocker that hung like a tired anchor on the door was gone. In its place, a new black keypad lock where a number would mean more than memory. I rang the bell and listened. The chime still climbed the same 3 notes into the stairwell. Rhea opened the door with eyebrows already raised, as if I had been late to a meeting. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice from falling into old grooves. She stepped aside. Inside, boxes were stacked like gray boulders along the foyer. Father's cane, his last one, with the walnut handle, leaned against a wall where it had never leaned before. The air had that chalky smell of cardboard tape and dust, unsettled and busy. "Talk about what?" "The estate is simple," she said, motioning me toward the kitchen. The morning sun fell across the countertops, catching on the tiny scratches we used to make with cereal bowls. Simple. I could hear myself trying to be gentle. "There's a will. We were supposed to go through it together." "We are," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. She slid a sheet of paper across the island. It was a photocopy with my father's name typed neatly at the top, the edges shadowed as if the machine had breathed on it. "Dad had me help with a transfer last year. The house is in my name. He wanted things streamlined." I felt the room tilt, just slightly. What? He was in treatment last year. He was barely driving. I traced the lines of the photocopy with my gaze. The letters were perfectly black, perfectly aligned. Everything but my father's signature, which curved like something once alive and now stiff. Rhea shrugged. He was clear as daylight. We talked about it over weeks. Lawyer did the paperwork. "The will leaves you money, I keep the house. It's fair." Her words threaded the air, neat and practical, and yet something inside me threaded backward, toward the nights I'd drive Dad to his appointments, our quiet talks in the dark where he'd squeeze my hand and call the house our last family harbor. He said it smelled like rain and books, like safety. I set the paper down and let my fingers rest against the cool stone. "I need to see the original," I said. "All of it. The will, the transfer." "That's not necessary," she answered, too quickly. "I've already filed everything with the county. The keys were changed for security." For security. The kettle of my morning cooled in my stomach. I glanced at the back window. The garden, our mother's garden, was already trimmed to low obedience. Rhea had always loved clean edges. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small ring with 2 keys and slid them toward me. "Garage and side door," she said. "In case you need to collect your things." My things. As if my childhood fit in a cardboard rectangle. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, which surprised me. "Rhea, when Dad and I talked," he said, I stopped. Our father had taught us to choose words with care. My sister's face was careful, too, all thin lines and pressed lips. I could try to drag truth into the light with my memory, or I could find the light itself. I'll be in touch, I said finally. She nodded as if we'd agreed on a deadline. I walked out into the chill and the soft noise of leaves scraping pavement. I stood at the curb and watched my breath lift like faint smoke. The house's windows flashed the sky back at me, unreadable. Behind the upstairs one, the blue room where Dad used to nap after chemo sat still. Somewhere a clock ticked. At home, I opened a fresh folder and wrote on the tab in small block letters, House. I placed the photocopy inside and left the folder on the table, a thin promise. The afternoon light slid along the wall and made a ladder of shadows. I brewed more tea and drank it slowly, counting the seconds until I could breathe without the taste of paper. That night, I dreamed of our father standing at the top of the stairs in the old house, one hand on the banister, asking us to come up. The light behind him was soft and ordinary. In the dream, I climbed, and Rhea stood at the bottom, counting something in her palm, her lips moving like prayer. I woke before dawn, the room the color of slate, and understood two things at once. My sister believed she had already won, and my father had not meant to leave me on the porch. The proof would not be in a memory. It would be in ink. The day began as if it had always been waiting to. The week unfurled like quiet cloth. I returned to work at the small library where I curated local history, news clippings, brittle programs from long-closed theaters, photos of river floods and parades. The stacks smelled of paper and patience. People asked about my father with soft eyes. I said, he passed in April, and watched the words land like petals. Grief had taught me how to stand up slowly. In the afternoons, I sorted through our family files, taxes, the mortgage, photocopies of passports that made us look like shy ghosts. The folder labeled Estate had my father's tidy handwriting, the same rounded script he used on school permission slips, grocery notes that always ended with "Love, Dad," as if the list itself needed affection. The will I found was dated the year before his last round of treatments. It named us both. It spoke of fairness with simple sentences: the house to be shared, proceeds to be split if sold, a small bequest for the library where he had volunteered, and a letter for each of us, to be opened privately. I held the letters like shells and listened for the ocean of his intention. Mine said, if home becomes heavy, lift it together. Don't let the door be a wall. The next morning I called the lawyer listed on the will, a man named Alan Pike whose voice on the phone sounded like worn leather. He had retired, his receptionist told me, but his records had been transferred down the hall to a younger partner. That younger partner, Miss Klein, agreed to meet. Her office smelled faintly of lemon and old air conditioning. Sun pooled on a marble table and made the documents brighter than my hands. Miss Klein clicked her pen. Your father indeed executed a will here, she said, tapping the copy I'd brought. As for a property transfer to your sister, that's not in our file. Sometimes clients handle those through a title company. Rhea said there was a contract, I said. Last year. She'll need to provide it if we're to review, Miss Klein replied. In any case, if there was a transfer, it would be recorded with the county. We can check the register. She typed. The silence had its own temperature while we waited. Finally, she looked up. There is a deed recorded 15 months ago. The house was quitclaimed from your father to your sister. It cites a private contract for consideration. My stomach sank, but the fall was slow enough to feel. Consideration, I repeated. The value exchanged, she said. Could be money. Could be caregiving expenses. Could be anything they agreed to. I remembered Rhea's practical mouth, the ledger in her eyes. After Mom died, Rhea had managed Dad's pills when I was at work. She liked control the way some people like music, it filled her. What did consideration look like in a kitchen filled with quiet and pain? What was counted, and what wasn't? I helped him too, I said, and knew even as I spoke that help is the currency families spend without keeping receipts. Even a valid deed can be challenged, Miss Klein said gently, if there's evidence of incapacity, undue influence, or fraud. But we'd need more than feelings. We'd need paper and a story that paper can hold. When I left the office, the sky had the bright, indifferent blue of late autumn. I walked the long way to my car. The city felt like a folder of its own, streets labeled, signatures of people flowing along sidewalks, ink made of breath. If the house had been quitclaimed, there should be a contract. If there was a contract, there should be a signature. And if there was a signature, it should either tell the truth or betray it. That night, I ate soup standing up and listened to the radiator tick, as if someone tapped out a code on metal bones. I thought about stakes, not money, though money's gravity pulled at everything, not even the house itself, though the ache for that front porch lived in my teeth. The stake was a story, what our family would believe about itself when the dust settled. Whether my father's last months would be remembered as clarity or confusion, kindness or a ledger. I called Rhea the next day. I made tea while the phone rang. The kettle had become a metronome to my decisions. Can you send me the contract? I asked when she picked up. There's no need, she said, lightness coating the words. Everything was filed. Alan at Westside Title has the original deed paperwork. I'll call him, I said. But the contract, the one the county record references, should be part of our files. She sighed. Elowen, this resistance isn't healthy. You're holding on to furniture when you should be holding on to memories. I watched steam curl out of the spout and vanish. I'm holding on to Dad's voice, I said. He said we'd share the home. If he changed his mind, I want to see how and why. She went quiet for a breath. You always needed the last word, she said finally. I'll have Alan email you what he has. The call ended not with a click but with a soft digital mercy. An hour later, a scanned deed arrived in my inbox, clean and square. It contained my father's name, Rhea's name, the legal description that read like a poem written by surveyors, and a line referencing a private contract filed between parties. It did not include the contract itself. I printed the document and laid it on my kitchen table. Sunlight made a small island of brightness over the signature line. My father's name curved there, familiar and strange. I traced the shape in the air above the page without touching it. In my mind, I saw his hand, shaky some days, careful others. He had taught me my own signature on bank forms when I was 12, his hand guiding mine so lightly I doubted he touched me at all. The next morning, I visited Westside Title. The receptionist wore a scarf the color of soft moss and spoke with that sunny professionalism that makes you want to behave. Alan, broad-shouldered, in a blue shirt, ushered me into a small glass-walled conference room. Outside, printers hummed like bees. Your sister mentioned you might stop by, he said. He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside, the deed paperwork was crisp, the notary seal pressed like a shallow fossil. There was also a checklist with boxes ticked neat. No contract. No explanation. Do you have the private contract referenced here? I asked. Alan shook his head. It wasn't recorded with us. Sometimes parties keep those for their records. I'm one of the parties, I said, and let the sentence sit. Then perhaps your sister has it. I nodded, thanked him, and walked out into the late sun, which had tilted by degrees while we were indoors. Leaves skittered at my feet. The air smelled like dry grass and distant wood smoke. I thought of Dad's letter again, don't let the door be a wall. They say the law is a door if you know how to push. I had my hand on it now, palm flat, feeling for the hinge. I wrote to Rhea again, this time by email so the words would sit still. I asked for the contract and suggested we meet with Ms. Klein present. She replied with a single line, I'll look. It took 4 days for her to find exactly nothing. By then, the world had tilted further into early winter. Streetlights clicked on before I left the library. The reference desk lamp made a warm circle I didn't want to step out of. I began walking home by a route that passed the courthouse, solid, square, its windows like eyes that had seen 1,000 arguments soften into agreements. On a gray Thursday, Miss Klein called. "I spoke with a handwriting examiner I trust," she said. "If we can get samples of your father's signature from around the same time, she can offer an opinion about the deed." I thought of checks Dad had signed for medications, a birthday card to our aunt, the form I'd filed to renew his disabled parking permit. "I can gather those," I said. "And the contract?" she asked. "Rhea says she can't locate it." A pause, and then, "Contracts like that aren't always the problem. Their absence often is." I collected signatures like someone collecting shells after a storm, each one carrying the shape of a day. I found a pocket calendar where Dad had signed small initials next to dentist appointments and a receipt for the mechanic with his longer swing of letters. I held them up to the deed and felt something I couldn't name. Not quite mismatch, not quite match. Instead, the signatures felt like different rooms in the same house, familiar floor plan, odd lighting. Late Saturday, I drove to the old house. I parked a street away and walked beneath trees that had lost half their leaves and not one of their shadows. In my coat pocket, my hand closed around the keys Rhea had given me. I tried the side door. The new lock accepted me with a mechanical chirp, the sound of welcome purchased. Inside, the house breathed its old breath, lemon oil, cardboard, coffee. The kitchen boxes were fewer. A label that read, "Frames, basement," crouched on the floor. I stood in the entrance between hallway and dining room and felt times 2 hands, one pushing, one pulling. Then I went downstairs. Dad had kept files in a metal cabinet next to the washing machine, a dent in the left side from where the dryer door had once snapped back too hard. The key was in the top drawer, as always, under the blue screwdriver. Some habits survive new locks. Inside were tax returns in neat stacks and a folder labeled House, Major. I pulled the drawer open and sat on the little wooden stool we used to use for canning. The folder contained home repair contracts, permits, one letter from a contractor who'd tried to change terms mid-job and had been answered by my father's stern but polite corrections. Beneath those, a smaller envelope lay slightly askew. On its front, in Dad's hand, transfer options, talked with a draft only. My heartbeat made a blunt sound in my ears. Inside was a contract template, printed from some form site, with fields filled in by blue ink. The handwriting was Rhea's, not Dad's. The numbers were precise, the edges of letters clipped like trimmed hedges. It proposed that, in exchange for Rhea's caregiving and payment of one tax lien, Dad would transfer the house to her, with a clause permitting Elowen reasonable access to sentimental items. There were 2 signature lines at the bottom. On the second, where my father's name was printed, his signature curved. Beneath it, though, something else sat, a date in Rhea's hand, and an unsteady initial I recognized as Dad's, corrected, as if he had tried and then stopped. I turned the page and saw faint indentations, as if someone had pressed hard while writing on a sheet above. I angled the paper toward the bare bulb's light. The ghost of words appeared like a shoreline at low tide. I remembered a trick from the library lab and went upstairs to the kitchen junk drawer. The pencil I found had half an eraser left and the patience of graphite. I shaded gently across the page. The indentations rose, becoming legible, a sentence added to the draft, in Rhea's hand, "This agreement supersedes any prior testamentary documents regarding the property," and then a line that had been crossed out with such force the paper slided in the middle. My phone's flashlight made the graphite shine. I took photos, then more, until the angles and shadows gave the page a voice. Then I tilted the original under the light again and saw something small in the right margin. Dad's own hand had written, in thin letters, "No change to will without Elle's consent." An arrow pointed to the crossed-out line. I sat back and listened to the house. It was not quiet, it had its own soft chorus, the refrigerator's hum, the settling beams, the rain starting thin on the back steps. My father had argued with a pen when his body was too tired to argue with a person. This was not a contract, this was a draft, marked like a student's paper, awaiting revision. It had been filed away, then forgotten, or concealed. I placed the envelope back in the folder and hesitated. Leaving it would keep the battlefield pure, taking it would secure the evidence from vanishing into a new organizer's bins. I did what archivists do when faced with a document that belongs to a story and to everyone in it. I documented the location, I photographed it in situ, and I took it with me for safekeeping, leaving a note in the file, temporarily removed by Elowen H. 10:32 p.m., for review with counsel. When I reached the top of the basement stairs, I heard the faint click of the front door. A silhouette paused in the foyer. Ria's voice, careful, called, "El. That you?" She flicked on the light and looked at me as if I had walked out of a mirror. "I was checking for Dad's letters," I said, and held her gaze as the basement bulb continued to burn, throwing a cheap halo around us. She crossed her arms. "You know you should tell me when you come." "And you should have told me when you changed the locks," I answered, but my voice was soft. In a family, tone is its own attorney. Her eyes fell to the folder in my hand. "What's that?" "Drafts," I said. "Let's read them together." But we didn't. She told me she had dinner plans. I told her I was leaving. We stood there in the foyer where our mother had once measured our heights on the doorframe. The pencil marks still climbed in a ladder beside Ria's shoulder. She didn't look at them. Later, in my apartment, I spread the documents under a lamp. The room smelled faintly of rain from my coat steaming dry. Ms. Klein replied to my midnight email at 6:12 a.m., like someone who slept with an ear to the ground. "Bring everything," she wrote. "We'll let the paper talk." The courthouse hearing took place in a small probate chamber with beige walls and a clock that ticked with a tinny determination. Morning light slid along the judge's bench and made a small rectangle on the carpet, where it sat politely for an hour. Ms. Klein spoke with the calm of someone sorting linen. Ria sat across from me with her lips pressed thin and her hands neat in her lap. I'd chosen a navy dress because it felt like a kind of truth, unadorned, steady. We entered exhibits, the will, the deed, the draft contract with its ghost words, the photographs of indentations coaxed by pencil. The handwriting examiner, a woman with silver hair and an engineer's eyes, testified that the deed signature looked copied in motion, its pressure unnaturally uniform for my father's health at the time. Not a traced forgery, she clarified, but a signature guided by a model, likely under instruction or fatigue. Ria's attorney argued that my sister had cared for our father while I pursued personal interests, my job at the library, recast as a hobby, that Dad wanted to reward the child who showed up every day. He pointed to the tax lien resolved that spring and to notes in Ria's planner, pills checked, appointments made, groceries bought. Each line was a kind of love, I couldn't deny it. I had made other lists, softer, unwritten, the way Dad liked his tea, the way he hated the word battle for illness, the way he once asked me to read him the ending of a detective novel twice because he liked the tie-up, the justice without blood. Ms. Klein's voice remained steady. "Intent is the star by which we walk," she said, and placed Dad's letter to me and to the library director side by side, both written during those months. "He speaks in present light of sharing, of fairness, of leaving a place intact." She held up the draft contract. "And when offered a change, he writes, no change to will without El's consent." The door he wanted was one both daughters could open. The deed, executed after this draft and absent the very contract it cites, tells a different story. The court should ask why. The judge leaned forward. His questions were quiet and thorough, like a neighbor's. He asked Rhea about the day the deed was signed. She said Dad had been tired but determined. She said she had handled the paper because he hated forms. Her voice wavered once on the word hated, as if a thread had pulled in the wrong place and the whole seam tugged. He asked me whether I sought to punish my sister. I said no, and meant it. I wanted a truth that could hold weight without cracking. I wanted the house to be what it had been, a place that forgave our mistakes by standing anyway. The judge took a recess. The clock ticked. In the hallway, the vending machine offered rows of bright candy, as if justice had a sugar aisle. Rhea stood by the window, staring at cars, her hands wrapped around her arms as if holding herself up. When he got scared, she said, not looking at me, he wanted me. I live 5 blocks away. You live 12 minutes. I know, I said. You were there for the worst mornings. And I fixed things, she added, as if that mattered most. I kept the house from bleeding money. You read to him. I paid the plumber. And both were needed, I said. But fixes aren't titles, Rhea. She finally faced me. The sunlight threw a pale gloss over her cheekbone. Dad told me once he worried about you. That you fell in love with ideas. He said the house wasn't an idea. It's not, I said, swallowing. It's a ground. And it should hold us both. The judge's clerk called us back. The ruling didn't rise like music, it arrived like a careful paragraph. The deed would be set aside pending a full accounting and mediation, the will would control. The court was concerned by the draft's marginalia, the absence of the contract, and the examiner's testimony. The judge's voice softened when he said our father's name. He concluded by asking us to use the next 30 days to attempt a settlement befitting a family that once shared a table. Outside, the air felt rinsed. Miss Klein squeezed my shoulder. Rhea stepped onto the courthouse steps, blinked at the light, and exhaled a sentence I hadn't expected. I don't want half. I want safety. Then take safety, I said. We can sell and split, or keep and rent to cover costs. We can build safety without stealing memory. She looked past me, toward a bench where someone had left a glove. I panicked, she said. The words were tiny birds that had finally flown from a thicket. When the bills came and he slept all afternoon. I wanted something solid. I asked him to sign because I didn't know what else to do. You could have asked me, I said, and the word asked tasted like weather, something soft that still changes streets. She nodded. I was ashamed. Shame is a lock you put on yourself. It can feel like safety until you can't breathe. We stood there, 2 women holding an old door between us, neither quite ready to close it or walk through. We agreed to mediation the following week. It took place in a room with a tulle fern and a table that tried to look friendly. The mediator spoke in a voice that seemed wrapped in felt. We went point by point, the house's value, the unpaid bills, the time we had each given and the holes left by the hours we could not. I surprised myself by asking about Rhea's mortgage, her job, the nights she'd sat awake listening to Dad breathe. She surprised me by asking for the library bequest to be increased. At the end, we sketched a plan that looked like forgiveness in arithmetic. We would sell the house in the spring. After paying debts and taxes, we would split the proceeds equally. I would receive the blue room's bookshelves and Mom's garden bench. Rhea would receive Dad's watch and the walnut-handled cane. The mediator nodded, pleased as if we had invented compromise. Before we left, Rhea reached into her bag and handed me a smaller envelope. I found this after you emailed, she said. I didn't know what to do with it. It was a photocopy of a note my father had written to our neighbor, a witness for the day he had planned to update his will but had, apparently, felt too tired to go. The note said, ran out of strength today. We'll do it with both girls next week. Keep me honest, Mike. The margin showed a doodle of a little house with smoke coming out of its chimney. It looked like the houses children draw when they are certain love is a shape. I slipped the note into my folder and touched the edge as if it might bruise. We signed the mediation agreement. The fern watched like a green witness. The day felt ordinary again, which was the most extraordinary thing it could have felt. We listed the house after the new year when the air was so cold it rang. I packed Dad's books into banana boxes the grocery store gave me for free, their sweet smell mixing with paper dust. Rhea took the framed photos down carefully, as if the glass could remember falling. We argued over nothing once, where to store the old coffee grinder, and then laughed, embarrassed by our reflexes. On the last afternoon before the first showing, I sat on the garden bench and watched the light turn the maple into a lantern. The bench's wood was gray and soft, and when I moved, it sighed the way old wood does, bearing you with complaint and love. I took out a small notebook and wrote, "Keep the door a door." I wasn't sure if it was a rule or a prayer. The sale went as sales do, too many shoes stepped on the rugs, too many compliments about good bones, numbers floated, then settled. When the final offer came and we accepted, I went home and made a stew that cooked all day and gave its heat slowly back. I called Ms. Klein to thank her. She told me to rest. I slept for 12 hours and dreamed of the house as a boat, cutting through a calm river, heading toward a shore where both of us waited. We closed in early spring. The check felt heavy as a stone you choose to keep, not because it is beautiful but because it explains a place. Rhea and I met on the front steps one more time, keys between us like coins. She handed me Dad's watch. I gave her Mom's recipe box. We kept the bench and the cane as planned. There were no speeches, just a small wind that moved the chimes on the neighbor's porch. "Do you think he'd be mad?" she asked. "Maybe at the paperwork," I said. "Not at us ending it honestly." She nodded, and for the first time in months, her face looked like the one from photographs where we were 8 and 10, faces smudged with popsicle evidence, our mother's fingers curling around our shoulders like commas. Later that week, I took the bench to my apartment's small balcony. It looked too grand for the space and exactly right. I started a little herb garden, basil, thyme, a brave rosemary that bent in the wind and refused to break. On Sundays, I read on that bench with the walnut-handled cane leaning nearby like a quiet sentinel. Sometimes, when dusk came early, I'd hold Dad's watch in my palm and listen to its steady heart. It did not tell me the past, it did not forecast the future. It simply kept time without opinion. I wrote a letter to my father. I told him what we'd done and what we hadn't. I told him about the day the courthouse light made a rectangle on the carpet and how the judge spoke his name as if it were a place. I told him I was learning that homes can travel if you carry the right parts. When I finished, I placed the letter in the library's local history archives in a sealed envelope labeled, "To be opened by Elowen Hart, someday." The archivist in me knew such a thing was indulgent. The daughter in me knew it was a map. Rhea and I began meeting for coffee every other Wednesday. We called it inventory, a joke at first, then a ritual. We filled a spreadsheet with practicalities, taxes paid, utilities closed, donations made, and then, when the columns were quiet, we spoke about other things. The way spring rain smelled like pennies. The way Dad had once pretended to lose at Scrabble when we were little and then later beat us mercilessly, to teach humility. We cried in public once. The barista put extra napkins on the table and didn't make it a thing. A year later, I walked past the old house. The new owners had painted the door a fearless green. The porch boards were replaced, the gutters straight. Through the window, I saw a lamp burn like a small sun in a new constellation. I stood on the sidewalk and felt no theft in my chest, just a movement like tide. Some stories end not with reclamation but with a different shape of belonging. I had my bench, my cane, my watch, and a map to a life that didn't require a specific address to be true. On my balcony, the rosemary had become woody and stubborn. I trimmed it and tucked the small fragrant sprigs into envelopes addressed to friends. For keeping, I wrote on slips of paper. I sent one to Rhea, with a note that said, "For your kitchen window. For the days you need a smell that says, it's all right to begin again." She sent back a photo of the plant on her sill, sunlight turning the leaves into tiny lances of brightness. Beneath the photo, she wrote, "Thanks for not leaving me on the porch." I set the phone down and listened to the city's evening, a bus exhaling at the corner, a child laughing 2 floors below, a violin practicing somewhere thin and determined. I thought of Dad's doodled house with its chimney smoke, a child's certainty that warmth is a promise you can draw. I thought, too, of the words he wrote, the ones that unlatched a door we'd almost nailed shut, no change to will without Elle's consent. He was asking, in his way, for us to look at each other, to hold the paper up to the light together. Later, when night folded over the balcony like a blanket, I took out my notebook and listed what I owned that mattered: a bench that remembered our mother's laughter, a cane that had steadied our father, a watch that kept faith with minutes, a sister who could say, "I panicked," and then choose a better verb. And I listed the things I'd let go: the porch boards, the lemon oil kitchen, the weight of a lock code I'd never wanted. Between the lists, there was air. In that air, a quieter kind of revenge, the kind that returns the story to its right size and sets it down without ceremony. Some nights, I read this story aloud, to the rosemary, to the skyline, to myself, because telling is a way of keeping, too. My voice lowers at the part where the house becomes a boat. It rises slightly at the part where the judge speaks our Father's name. It settles at the end, where I write that doors are only walls if you let them be. Then I close the notebook, sit back on the bench, and listen as the city keeps time with the watch in my palm. The seconds pass, steady as breath, and the quiet feels earned.